welcome to the Jeff Buller Show. Today I have with me David Nour. Now, David is an internationally recognised leading expert on strategic business relationships, and the key word here is strategic relationships. As the author of 10 books, including Co-Create and his current one, Curve Benders. What does curve benders mean? We're about to find out. Maybe it goes with curve blenders, not sure, but it's going to be about relationships. David serves as a trust advisor to global clients and coaches corporate leaders and rising entrepreneurs. He speaks about 50 to 60 times a year around the world when he can. With current situation, we know that's been reduced a little bit for all of us. So he's the adjunct professor at the Emory University and was named Thinkers 50 Radar Class 2021 and Global Gurus top 30 leadership professional list. He's a Forbes leadership contributor on the future of work, and we're going to chat a little bit about that. And also Inc. on relationship economics. Seems to be a current theme here called relationships. So his unique insights have been featured in a variety of prominent publications, including Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Fast Company, Huffington Post Business, Entrepreneur, and Knowledge, and Wharton. He's originally from Iran, and his parents are still there, and he lives in Atlanta, Georgia, and has for 40 years. So welcome to the show, David. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and I look forward to hearing some insights and words of wisdom to share with our audience.
Jeff, it's good to be with you.
It's an absolute pleasure, mate. So I'm in Sydney, you're in Atlanta, Georgia, and we're maybe in the middle of the future of work. So, David, you flew into the country in 1981, you landed in JFK, and you headed south and turned up in Atlanta, Georgia. Is that correct?
It is. As you were kind enough to mention, my parents still live in Iran. Now that I'm a parent myself, Jeff, I can't imagine the incredibly unselfish task of, packing up your kid and with a suitcase and at that time $100, and they shipped me to a place where I didn't know anybody. I didn't speak the language. Thankfully, I flew down to Atlanta and lived with an aunt and uncle that I hadn't seen since birth. I grew up here, finished high school, attended university, and grew up here. So this is home in many ways. Mom and dad, excuse me, and a whole lot of cousins still live in Atlanta, and live in Iran. Excuse me. And it's tough. It's tough being away. It's tough with the regime. It's tough with obviously this global pandemic, but you make the best of it, and it builds your resilience, and it builds your ability to overcome almost anything. So,
well, it's what the old saying, what doesn't break you makes you. And certainly I think resilience is important and being able to deal with change. But as humans, we typically, a lot of us resist change and are happy to take a job, take the gold watch at 65 and fade into the distance slowly. But you're very much about growth and relationships. So how did you get into the relationship business? Now, we're not talking dating. I just want to make it clear to everyone else here. This is not a love show. It's not a dating show. But I have met a lot of great people. So the relationship thing is about how to use strategic relationships to accelerate your business. So how did you get into this relationship business?
Great question. So like most professionals early on, I took jobs, and, early part of my career was sales management. And you really learn firsthand that people really do buy from people they like and they trust. And I'm going to add one more, they respect. And then I got into sales management, and I quickly learned people work for people they like and they trust and they respect. And so in many ways, regardless of what any of us do, I've always believed we're all fundamentally in the relationship business. Number two, being born abroad, having lived abroad, worked abroad, you quickly see firsthand that particularly in places like the Middle East, in parts of Asia, and certainly Latin America, the rest of the world builds relationships first from which they do business. And this is a terrible example, but your audience may or may not know, Bin Laden, bin, the literal translation in Arabic means son of. So your genealogy, your family lineage, where you come from matters more than any product or service that you may sell. I came to the States, and particularly in the US, but certainly other Western countries as well, it seems that if and only if the business part works, then we'll ask the person about their family, or ask about their loved ones, or ask about, really get a chance to get to know them, and more importantly, give them a chance to get to know us. And I said there's a disconnect, particularly when we go into places and people don't look like us, sound like us, or come from our backgrounds. So after my sales and sales management job, I got into consulting. After that, I went to graduate school and then spent several years at a private equity firm where we did 110 deals. And after that fund shut down, I went on a listening tour. And Jeff, I went to 35 leaders that I liked, I trusted, I respected. And I said, what do you believe I do exceptionally well? And I'm paraphrasing, but the consistent comment was, you network better than anybody we've ever met. If you can teach other people how to do that, you'll succeed. I sat and thought about it, and I said, networking is a lot of networking out there, and a lot of it is very pedestrian or retail oriented. And my background was enterprise. I wanted to work with enterprises. And I said, what if I helped individual leaders and their teams, because there's no relationship between logos or buildings. It's always individuals, right? Mm-hmm. What if I help them and their teams identify, build, nurture, over some period of time, sustain, and ultimately capitalize on what I believe is to be the biggest asset, which is their portfolio of relationships. And I started to think about these ideas and read about these ideas. And then, of course, I started teaching these ideas. And then somebody said, well, the idea sounds great. Can you help us implement it? And that became one of the first consulting projects. And that's what I've done for the last 20 years. So from speaking, as you were kind enough to mention, to that often leads to advisory, that often leads to coaching, that often leads to executive education and board retreats. And I've taken this fairly simple, fairly straightforward concept of relationships, and I've built some really interesting breadth and depth around it to accelerate enterprise growth, to accelerate value creation, to accelerate an entrepreneur gaining traction in the market, proving their value proposition, and then really scaling that idea. And those I can all lead back to really strategic relationships.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. You're selling to people, you're not selling to a business. A business is just an inanimate object, a name, a logo, whereas people actually have feelings, and they do love to deal with people that they like and love and respect, as you mentioned. And it's really interesting that, and I want to get more into the strategic approach that you obviously recommend, and you would obviously have some really strategic ways of doing that. What excited me, for example, in the whole relationship business, amongst many other things, is I came across the Dunbar number a while back, is that about 150 people is the maximum that as an individual you can maintain any form of relationship with. Then beyond that, it becomes a lot weaker. One of the phrases that really sort of burnt into my mind was weak ties and strong ties. Mm. And what I loved about social media initially was it allowed me to connect and build relationships with a social tribe of people that had common interests. No longer was it local, now it's gone global. And I'm sure you've had many conversations and consultancies around, I suppose, the future of business and the future of work, based upon that it's now become global much more than before. In other words, and what I love about social media, this intersection of humanity and technology, was the ability to take weak ties, build a connection, and then when you travel and visit them in a city like Atlanta, Georgia, or Sydney, you break bread with them, sit down with them, and you work out who you do get on with, who you do respect, and who you want to work with. And it's mutual. So the area you're in fascinates me from both. It's the implications of technology on that, because that's what I've been in for the last since mid-1980s when I left my teaching career, is the whole world of technology. And but I found it very dry and boring. So because I'm not an abstract guy, I'm more touch feel. And what I loved about social media was it actually was this intersection of humanity and technology. So let's step to the next thing I want to chat about, which is where I think you're really, really strategic, is, okay, so you go into an organization, then you would be consulting to them, and where do you start? Because do you sort of get context first, then you actually say, well, where do we need to build relationships? Take us through a little bit of a high level process of how you would approach relationship building to accelerate business growth. I think that would be for entrepreneurs and CMOs.
I'm happy to do it. Great question. You're exactly right. My most seminal work is a book called Relationship Economics. And I'm about to write the 3rd edition of this book. We've sold about 500,000 copies of it. And I talk about how to be more intentional, Jeff, how to be more strategic, and how to be more quantifiable in the relationships you choose to invest in.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. And the first chapter is top 10 reasons most networking doesn't work, because there's no purpose, there's no goal, there's no plan. So as I go into an organization, we talked about earlier, the relationship is always with an individual. So I typically work with P&L leaders, or I typically work with the CEO of that hyper growth company. And we get very focused on, tell me the outcomes you're after. And unfortunately, when it comes to relationships, a lot of people confuse output, what you do and how you do it, with outcome, which is the result, the outcome, the business outcome we're after. And you would get a chuckle out of this, and probably so the audience. I asked one executive, tell me about your priorities, tell me what you're trying to do. And he said, we've got 69 priorities. And I said, respectfully, you have no priorities, right? So we come up with typically 2 or 3 that they're really focused on. And then this process, I think, could be very relevant to almost any size company, any size organization. If you start with the end in mind, here's the outcome I'm after. The next series of questions, the next series of steps we go through is, okay, who do we need? Now, I had a chance to meet Jim Collins of the Good to Great fame, and I love his ask more who questions. And I don't think we do that. When we're faced with a challenge or an opportunity, we ask a lot of questions around what should we do and how should we do it. We don't ask enough who questions. So I take that idea one step further. Who do we need? There are no new challenges. There are no new problems. The only new challenges are the ones you haven't thought of. So we get very granular in identifying who else has seen this problem, who else has solved this problem, who else has addressed this challenge or opportunity. Next, and let's kind of identify these individuals, figure out who do we need. Next, we really focus on who do we know? Who do we already know? Who already knows us, likes us, trusts us, customers, partners, investors? Who's in our existing, what we call your relationship bank? Next is that by the way, could facilitate an introduction, could walk us in the door, could accelerate our ability to get to the person we need, to get to the outcome we need. And the entire process is predicated by what I call your relationship currency deposits. So what can I do? How can I invest in an existing relationship that will create access to or an opportunity with the relationship I need to then accelerate my ability to get to the outcome I'm after? Now, at this point, it's really important to convey to your audience, my job isn't to manipulate anybody. My job, I'm not trying to teach anybody how to use people. That's not it. The fundamental data, empirical data that we have is any goal. You throw enough time, money, effort, resources at it, you'll eventually get there. One of the most undervalued assets in any organization is, how do I leverage relationships, never use, but leverage relationships to get there in fraction of the time, at fraction of the cost, at fraction of the effort that it takes. So if, let's just say you're trying to recruit a really talented person. If it takes you 6 months, in the current market, if it takes you a year to find that person, What's the value of me helping you leverage your relationships to find that person in a month or 3 months, right? So that time to impact, that time to result is something we've proven relationships can actually deliver. And we've built something called a strategic relationship planning, SRP process, that takes every goal, every challenge through those 4 or 5 steps. And in the words of the famed philosopher, Britney Spears, none of this is rocket surgery, right? None of this is that complicated. You just have to be incredibly diligent, and you got to be data-driven. You got to be focused, and you have to create value with your existing relationships, who will then open up doors, who will then create access to the relationships you need to get things done. Does that make sense? Does that resonate?
Absolutely. Yeah, I do love the question instead of what, who. Excuse me. And I came from a sales. I was selling personal computers to corporates and government in the 80s when the PC revolution took off. So it was very much
286s. Remember 286s with the floppy drive?
802, 86, exactly. So and then there was the compatibles. There was the IBM PC. Then there was the compatibles came out to fight them, and yeah, I was in the middle of all that. I worked for one of the original IBM dealerships in Australia, and so this is when it was all just, it was the Wild West of computing back in 1984, 85.
I worked for a company called Computerland, and,
yes.
and we did the same thing. We was a retailer for our audience. There was no Dell, there was no websites. It was computer stores you would go into and pick up, the individual components and put them together. And yeah, it was Novell networks and
yes.
Hayes modems and dot matrix printers. I mean, it was just comical in today's technology.
Yeah, I love the blinking DOS cursor. You could get it in 3 colors: white, black, white, orange, and green was the flashing cursor. The PC did not have a very friendly user face for a while until Windows showed up and the Mac. So, but yeah,
it was good times. It was good times.
I had so much fun. But I won't tell you all the stories, but yeah, it was the Wild West of computing, a little bit like the Wild West of social media when it first started.
And if, just to build on that for a second, if you think about social media, and if you think about, I'm doing a project right now around personas and needs-based segmentation. Yeah, we can all find demographic information. I can identify psychographic behaviors and things people are likely to do. End of the day, you're trying to optimize the most efficient, the most effective way to build and nurture a relationship with someone that potentially has the need for whatever your products or services are. And what you're trying to do is really maximize the lifetime value of that customer or of that relationship while you minimize the acquisition cost. So that's, and I can add a lot more context to it, but that's in essence what you're trying to do is you're trying to find that ideal relationship profile that has a need for your product services and what's the most efficient path to reach them.
Yeah, I love your sort of the 10 biggest mistakes people make in relationship building. And the first one you mentioned was the biggest mistake that is, one, they need to know what their priorities are. Then they can work out who they need to accelerate their business growth. And so that, I think the first one you mentioned was lack of purpose. In other words, let's get focused. What's your priority? So we're very strategic and have a purpose for building relationships. The other one was fuzzy goals. So I suppose that sits in the space of, what was it, 97 priorities? Okay, in other words, you don't have any. Then you got lack of relationship development was the other one, and haphazard and reactive efforts were some of the others. And what's in it for them? That's, I think, excuse me, I think that's really important to understand, is that you've got to be asking, how can I help them as well? And in other words, because you just can't keep asking for help all the time, because you're going to look, frankly, a little bit desperate after a while.
I tell people it's a lot easier for you to have your hand out if you start by giving a hand, right?
Exactly.
And if you invest in those relationships, and you see this, Jeff, from some of the most sophisticated companies where in their messaging, in their communication, whether it's employees or customers or partners, whatever it is, you sit there, you be quiet. Let me tell you how smart we are. Let me tell you how great we are. They don't care. So I try to help clients think about how quickly can I appeal to their logical self-interest? How can I quickly position this as to, this is how you're better off because we're in a relationship. This is how you improve your condition. You improve your stature, outcomes, results you're after. So in many ways, if you approach that relationship as Yoda, less about you, more about how others are better off because of you, you're going to remove friction. You're going to remove pushback. You're going to minimize the time it takes to go through that dating process. And interestingly enough, sociologists tell us that when we meet somebody else, we give a little, they take, they judge, they give a little, we take, we judge, we give back. It's this natural exchange. Too much, too fast. And we're like, whoa, 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 dude, we just met, right? So back off a second. Not enough. And you're going to be perceived as cold or distant or untrustworthy, right? So like you're hiding something. So you have to meet people where they are in this natural exchange. And as you said it, value, right? If I add value to you, you get it, you appreciate it. Hopefully you'll reciprocate, add value back. And that's how we go from being a contact to now in a relationship. As you nurture that over time, you start to delineate some from others. Those become your really strategic. Those really become your most valuable relationships. And those are the relationships that will withstand test of time. They'll withstand any up or down in the market. That will stand, hopefully, a global pandemic. And it really allows you to achieve more with a lot less effort.
Yeah, it's. I think one of the phrases you used there was about putting out your hand first. In other words, and I think one of the most powerful training education I had was doing a 6-month communications course. And it was about you need to be self-aware before you can be aware of others, number one. In other words, stand back. And another thing I learned, which became really powerful both in business and in sales, and also in relationships, personal relationships, was ask questions, just listen, and just be quiet and listen and watch their body language, see how they feel, what this person is. Are they had a hard day? Are they look distracted? And just the power of just asking questions and not saying anything about yourself. Look at me. It's more about how can I help this person? And the way I've certainly found powerful was if I can listen to them and ask the right questions, then I'll understand where they are, how they're feeling, and then I'm in a much better position to help them and give them what they want. What do you think about the power of questions and listening in relationship building and sales?
Jeff, I think questions are invaluable. And let me just expand on that for a second. I've always believed great relationships come from great conversations. And great conversations come from great questions. So I've always cringed when sales professionals ask a senior executive, what keeps you up at night? I always want to say heartburn. You have a solution for that? Because it's just intellectually lazy. It shows that you've done no homework, no due diligence, and you can't have an intelligent conversation with somebody who's a prospective buyer. So I'm always a big believer of, if you want better answers, ask better questions. And often questions are the answers. Questions, and you can convey your credibility. One of the things that our research shows is that the biggest lag in a contact becoming a relationship is this perception of value, right? Do I like you?
Yep.
Do I trust you? Am I going to be better off? Do I need you? Am I going to be better off because of you? These are the things that if they're not saying it, they're thinking it. So this idea of credibility and conveying your credibility early eliminates a lot of those fears, uncertainty, and doubt. So I've always believed if you convey your credibility through the questions you ask, look at a couple of things it does. Number one, it demonstrates that you've done your homework. Number two, even if you're completely wrong, the fact that they'll take the time to clarify it gives you much stronger answers and you can learn. Number three, it almost becomes a relationship on-ramp. It accelerates that whole, what I call the four-step process, right? You ready? This is one of those mind-blowing insights. You ready? Like me, know me, trust me, pay me. It works in that sequence. If you would like somebody, hopefully we'll get a chance to get to know them. When you know them, when you get to know them, hopefully you can see that you can trust them. Only when we trust other people will we buy from them, and not just products and services, but buying on their ideas, buying on their perspective, buying on why we should do this project your way. So great questions. And by the way, you brought up listening, which I think is incredibly important. And listening isn't me being quiet long enough to figure out what I want to say as soon as you're done talking. It's actually intentionally listening to what you're saying and being knowledgeable, competent, capable enough in my field to then craft that conversation and the direction of that conversation. So I think questions are incredibly valuable. And I have two resources for your listeners. Hal Gregerson is the executive director of the MIT Leadership Center, and he's written a book called Questions Are the Answers. And a guy named Andrew Sobel, S-O-B-E-L, has written another book called Power Questions. Those are two really valuable resources in just elevating the questions you can ask to engage and influence others.
You mentioned the word listening, well, the phrase listening and how important it is. I totally agree with you. In fact, one of the best variations of, or additions to that is active listening. In other words, you hear what they say, you don't parrot back what they've said to you. You say, so what you said, I think is, and this becomes down to being a little tentative in your feedback. So what you meant was, tell me if I'm right or wrong here, but I thought you said A, B, or C. And they go, you're spot on. And when they say that to you, you're going, I've heard them, and they know I've heard them. And I'm not just thinking about the next thing to say. And I think one of the simplest things I can do when you meet someone is look in their face and notice the color of their eyes. Because then you are present, and then you can listen, and then you can actually then it becomes much more powerful once you do that. Those just simple things.
You're exactly right. As a matter of fact, I build on that and I talk about listen louder. Mm-hmm. Listen to what, not just what's said, but what's not being said.
Yep.
And by the way, that's one of the challenges in the last 18 months through this global pandemic, is because we haven't been able to travel and meet people in person. You're not picking up on a lot of those nonverbal communications, right?
Exactly.
Are they pausing and thinking, or is their screen frozen? Right. So you know, that's one of the, you know, drawbacks. You and I have both benefited from technology over the years, but one of the drawbacks of not being able to shake someone's hand, and in a non-creepy way, I'm a hugger, right? Not being able to hug people and break breads or have a meal with them, is that you're not picking up, particularly not just this one-on-one, but one-to-many. It's really difficult to pick up on those nonverbal communication, nonverbal clues. But if you listen louder, if you listen more intently, if you listen more proactively, you said, you can also identify, and I got to tell you in your audience, one of my favorite relationship building techniques. Harvard Business Review published an entire issue on this several years ago. And I think the title of the issue was Provoke Your Customers. And I've always believed if I can add value early on in any conversation, in any discussion, and it's not just a sales technique, I've done this with investors, I've done this with board members, I've done this with a curmudgeon old board members who don't want to do anything differently, right? If I can build that credibility, if I can build that rapport early on through the questions I ask, it often accelerates, again, that traction, it accelerates your ability to engage and influence. So as they share an idea, as they share a perspective, and this might be a useful tip for your audience, I'm certainly listening to what they're saying. I'm thinking about what they're saying, but I'm also thinking about what they're not saying and what they may not be thinking. And I come back with, Jeff, that's interesting. Love where you're coming from. I'm just curious. What about this aspect? What about this facet of it? And by respectfully, and I've always believed a certain dose of respectful pushback is healthy in relationships. By really pushing in on a topic that they may have not thought of, you're provoking them to think differently, to lead differently, to consider a different perspective. And it goes back to 3 types of needs, right? In every interaction, there's 3 types of needs. One is an existing need. I know what I need from you. And if I know I need from you, I can get it from a whole bunch of places, and you unfortunately become a commodity, and you get into price wars and bidding, and I can go find that a whole lot of other places. The second type of need is an impending one. I don't need it today, but I might need it, or a good chance I will need it, right? With this mergers and acquisition, or with this new product launch, or with whatever that next step is. So if you can anticipate what they'll need next, it's impending, it becomes a richer conversation. By far, in 20 years of doing this, my favorite kind of need is need you create, because they haven't even thought of it. They haven't even anticipated that. They're just kind of executing and operationalizing what they do today. And in the middle of that conversation, you ask a question, and I love my favorite response. I know I'm there when they say, that's interesting. We've never thought about it that way. And that's when you know you're building a rich value-based conversation, rich value-based discussion. And you're getting, an old manager of mine used to say, get your return ticket punched. You're getting your return ticket punched because they're going to want to know more from you, about your lens or perspective.
I think it's a great point. In other words, what you're doing is you gain a lot of respect by doing that, because you're so far ahead of the game that you're going to add value to the organization in the future. And that instantly raises credibility.
And I've always said, in a humorous way, have you ever tried pushing a rope? Well, it just doesn't work. So if you try to create gravity or pull for your idea, again, forget the products or services for a second. If you create gravity or pull for your ideas, for your perspective, for your approach to solving that problem or that decision making, you suddenly become an object of interest. You suddenly become someone they want to get to know more, somebody who will return your calls and emails because every time they talk to you, you have an interesting idea or perspective. Do I have a product or service I want to sell? We all do at some point. But you know what? Most people have a BS radar, and they will disengage if you push. Remember that whole give and take, right? And if you push too hard, too fast, too soon, you're going to get the pushback. You're going to get, no, thank you, not interested. So interestingly enough, and it makes a lot of sales leaders cringe when I go to talk to sales teams about stop selling. Stop selling, because they already know you're there to sell something. If you solve a problem, if you add a unique value, if you provoke them, if you bring a unique perspective, if you introduce someone that could be an asset to them, you just dramatically elevated your position from everybody else who's just there to do a transaction.
Exactly. It's And it's that self-awareness by listening and watching the body language. And this is the thing we're finding challenging in the current environment, is that we're not reading those subtle signals, the movement of the feet or the moving of the chair. It's the, all you've got is the eyes and the face, which is, you know, the doorway to the soul. We know that. But the reality is that there's a lot more going on. And we're trying to use Zoom to create a relationship these days a lot of the time. And it's fabulous. But yes, the relationships are very important, and being able to just be aware of the individual. And I think be aware that that they have problems too, that they have had a tough day, and just being aware. And the touch part is, I think, is important. I'm a hugger too. I remember hugging my brother for the first time. We never sort of did that as kids, and he was in his, I think, 30s or 40s, and I hugged him for the first time, and he almost recoiled. Guess what? Every time we meet now, it's a hug. He's an accountant, so we'll give him a little bit of slack on that. That's okay. But yeah, it's the real, I suppose, the physical cues, the emotional cues that you just can't pick up unless you are, yeah. And the other term I love to use is a bullshit detector. I think that's, you're right, that people, they know you're here to sell. So you need to nurture that relationship. So then you can be going, if I don't use this guy or lady or man, person, I might miss out on a lot because they are so far ahead of the game. And I think that raises the other thing that I noticed you talked about was personal growth as well, or growth. You've got to be growing all the time. And I think a lot of people just don't read enough. They don't give themselves the permission to read, to watch and learn and grow each day. They go, oh God, I read for an hour. That's a waste of time. So what's your perspective on growth as a professional, and what sort of time do you dedicate to that?
If you believe my assertion that beyond your educational foundation, beyond your professional pedigree, your biggest asset is your portfolio of relationships. Like any asset, I'm always looking to enhance it. I'm always looking to elevate it. I'm always looking to create a greater return on that investment into that asset. And I've always believed the day you stop learning, the day you stop growing, Jeff, you're no longer valuable to that asset, because
Exactly.
That's when you start to become complacent. That's when you become stagnant. That's when you start to talk about an idea that people were using 5 years ago and it's new to you versus right. What are they trying to do? Where they're trying to go? So I'm a huge believer of that lifelong learning, not as a cliche, not as a something that you say, but you actually got to proactively engage in it. So again, I've been blessed to write 11 books. My dad drove into me that leaders are readers and readers are leaders. So I'm reading 3-4 books at a time. I subscribe to 22 different newsletters that I read religiously. Several magazines show up that I read cover to cover, including the ads. You can't see it, but here in my office, in the corner of my office, I have a clothes tree, and on it are all my name badges from various speaking engagements. And you were kind enough to mention in my intro that pre-pandemic, I would speak 50, 60 times a year. So imagine almost 20 years worth of name badges on this clothes tree. I mean, you can't see the metal rods, right? And everybody who comes in and sees it says, oh my gosh, what is that? And I explain it. And then I remind them every one of those was a learning opportunity. It wasn't just that I showed up and I delivered my content. It was also a phenomenal opportunity to learn about manufacturing industry and financial services. And I'm right now working with a company that makes cement in refractories where they melt metals, steel and aluminum and those kinds of things, right? before this, I didn't know anything about. I mean, it's just one of those industries you don't think about, right? But it's fascinating. And every one of those speaking engagements, I would show up early, sit in back of the room. Nobody knows who you are. Nobody cares. And you can pick up amazing insights. And then after you speak, they want to take you home. They can't take you, so they want to take whatever else you have or talk to you. And so I pride myself. I'm a truly a lifelong learner, and I coach most people that do whatever works for you. I listen to podcasts in the morning when I work out and I take the dogs for a walk, or I read different kinds of books, because as you said, I don't want to waste an hour on something and think that was a waste of time. So I read a lot of different kinds of books and different types of industry publications and whatnot. And it really creates that spice of variety in one's life. And you get it's like intellectual food. You don't know when or how you'll use it, but interestingly enough, becomes very useful in that next relationship conversation, that next executive you're trying to engage, you're trying to influence.
Yeah, I think for me, it's been, luckily I was a reader from the age of 5, and quite often I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my lamp burning on my arm, but because I was sleeping under the covers because my parents had told me to turn off the light. And I was also the librarian's best friend. I thought I was stalking them, I think, at primary school. I've been blessed to be a reader from as soon as I discovered words. And for me, I can't, like my kids and friends, for me, it's to share, be interesting, I think is important too. Like if you read, you're going to be interesting. I came across this idea, what do you think? But the importance of feeding your mind regularly with interesting things. And sometimes you just go and I go to some random sort of rabbit holes with reading as well. But, and I think the other thing that 40 to 50% of the population are knowledge workers. So you need to be continuing to learn and gain knowledge.
And let me build on that. Just 2 quick points. I'm grateful to my wife. Wendy and I just celebrated 25 years. And one of the amazing things she did with our children early on is she developed a love of reading in them. And it wasn't forced like a school, you have to go read these 20 pages. It was, she introduced them to books that they wanted to read. And they she's an avid reader and she reads a lot of kind of fiction stuff, but the kids have just developed this love. And I think as a parent, that's one of the best things we can do for our children. Number one. Number two, I ask a lot of executives, how do you learn? How do you grow? And a lot of them say, well, I read magazines and books and stuff. And in some ways it's passive, unless you find immediate opportunities to apply those insights. So in a non-creepy way, I typically find the authors that have written the books that I'm reading. And I reach out to them and I invite them to be guests on my podcast, or, I make sure I know where they're speaking nearby to go hear them if possible. Or so really immersing yourself in that topic, really immersing yourself in not just reading it, but understanding it, internalizing it, synthesizing it, and then as quickly as possible, applying it. And that's where that growth comes from. And it's often, my last comment on this is, it's often uncomfortable, right? Especially the older we get, we don't like to be bad at anything. We don't like to, wait, I've never heard of OKRs. What are they? And how do they work? And what are they about? And so being willing to be bad at something and embracing a new idea, a new approach, that's where that growth is going to come from, is just often a place of discomfort. But the second time I explained something to somebody, I felt more confident. The third time I draw it and illustrate it on a wall or an easel or a pad somewhere, I feel more confident. And it's amazing how often, it's another one of those relationship ramps where I always feel like I'm at my best when I'm at an easel or a whiteboard, or more recently, a digital whiteboard.
Totally agree with that.
Right, Jeff, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? And they take the marker from you. Remember, they take the marker from you and they're like, no, I like this, but what if we did this, this, and this? And it just takes the relationship to a very different level very quickly. And I'm a big big fan of that immersive learning experience, that really highly engaged experiential learning that I think could benefit us all.
Yeah, I think you mentioned about using whiteboards to actually take what's on your mind and put it actually in black and white or green and white, depending on the color of the pen. But the reality is that by doing that, you have to distill what's a fuzzy idea maybe in your mind, and actually have to distill it and make it and give it clarity on the whiteboard. And as you do that, and I used to really enjoy running workshops. I don't do them now, but I used to run workshops in, we call them whiteboard sessions. And it was just so much fun to do that. And it builds relationships. Like I said, they actually, well, this is what I think, or that one is so very, very important. Now, the thing I want to ask you, I'm very curious about, you were told that your superpower was relationships, okay? So, personally and in your business life, what are the tools and tactics that you use to build relationships? I'm curious about that.
You're this one might surprise you. I'm going to give you 3. First one, I have to contribute to my mother, and the context in which she brought it up was dating, and dating attractive women, and just a dating process. But she basically said, unexpected gifts at unexpected times. Mm-hmm. And that's something I do often, which is you talk to a relationship. It could be a client, it could be an investor, it could be a partner, board member, whatever. And they mention something, right? So one of my clients mentions, we vacationed at a really nice resort, and she mentioned that they'd never been. So I found one of the best travel guides for that destination that we were big fans of. And I wrote a personal handwritten note, and I sent her the book. And I said, here, and I highlighted and I earmarked some pages, and here's some things you want to check out. And Jeff, you might as well thought I'd bought her a mansion, because she was so grateful. And the book cost me, I think, $20, right? It reiterates, it's never the price of it. It's always the thoughtfulness.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And just like that, how many emails do you get a day? A couple hundred. How many emails do we send out? Probably the same number. Yet, how many personal handwritten notes do you get a day? How many do we send out? So I still send out personal handwritten notes, right? And the rule of 3 with those is, she should send it within 3 days of having met someone. Shouldn't take you more than 3 minutes. Shouldn't be longer than 3 sentences. Nobody wants war and peace in a handwritten note, right? Mm-hmm. So, and by the way, I put a stamp on them. And for your younger audience, stamps are these little square things we put on envelopes, and we ship things off to people. And right, so those work really well. And then on the digital front, I'm an avid LinkedIn fan and user. I think I was user number 3,000. Now they've got several 100 million users. But it's not going to replace, and you and I talked about this earlier, it's not going to replace you and I meeting in person. But those tools allow us to get in touch, do our due diligence, stay in touch, add value. We have our, I can rattle off several others. We have a private community called the Nour Forum. I use a app called Circle Back, which matches your contacts on your smartphone with the contact details on their social media, and it allows you to sync and update the two. So there's a handful of things, that a lot of tools that I use, but the most impactful ones are the highly personal ones. The most impactful ones are the ones you were very intentional about, and it really helps you set yourself apart from everybody else.
Yeah, it's sometimes just the simplest and most personal things that make the biggest difference. Like you said, you bought the book and you thought she bought you a mansion, might as well have. There's a really good friend of mine who has a list of 2,500 people, I think it is now. He remembers their birthdays and will either call them or send them a message. And I learned that from my partner too. And you know what? You got tools to do that. It's called an online calendar, and you just need to put in an alert once a year and just send them a text. And I don't expect them to remember mine. I don't care. Or maybe do care a little bit, but the reality is just remembering a birthday.
And again, for your audience, everybody's favorite subject is themselves.
Exactly.
So the things you can do to help them celebrate, even the smallest wins. And by the way, this applies as much for your employees as it does the partners, as it does, like I said, customers and investors and any relationship that's important to you. By the way, sociologists call this being ambient aware. The more knowledgeable you are about your relationships, the more proactively you can nurture them. And this is not a Spanish Inquisition. You're not there to ask 75 questions of, Jeff, where were you on the night of October 12th? It's as in your regular conversations, people will give you information. As you said, be savvy enough to capture them in your notes, in your calendar, whatever medium you deem appropriate, but then acting on it, right? So, remembering their spouse, remembering their kids. This is what I said. A lot of this stuff seems really elementary, but it makes a world of difference of, hey, how is Susan? And your son, Josh, wasn't he going to university? How's he doing? And those are the things that, think about it. Think about somebody does that to us. We're like, oh my gosh, he or she remembered. They cared enough to remember. They cared enough to bring it up. And by the way, how's your wife doing? And they reciprocate. So it is a really simple technique of just capture additional details you'll learn about individuals along the way. Another quick tip for your audience, again, another relationship on-ramp. One thing I've learned, particularly with executives, is they have a philanthropic passion. There's typically children's hospitals or pets or elderly or the environment, something they're passionate about. In your natural, don't force it because it comes across as scripted. But in your natural conversations, if you can find out that which they're passionate about, and likewise, to invest in that relationship, invest in that passion, it sets you apart from everybody else. So my wife and I, again, pre-pandemic, I think we attend some 20 different black tie events, and we don't just buy tickets, we buy a table. And at that table, I invite relationships that are passionate about that cause, whether it's a local museum or a reading campaign, or it's scouting or whatever it is. And you invite like-minded people to those events. And it's a fantastic chance to connect around something other than business that they're passionate about. And it really, again, sets you apart from everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. I think they don't teach us very much about communication and relationship building and nurturing at school. And quite often our parents don't. Some do. Your mother obviously did for you, that unsurprised small thing. What was the phrase you used on that?
Unexpected gifts at unexpected times.
I love that phrase. That's really, really cool. So just to wrap it up, you mentioned in some of your books, one of your books, about the forces impacting your future. That could be a future of your work or your future. And in the middle of what's happening now, because as a consultant, a lot of people are consultants, a lot of people in the knowledge industry, what are some of the big forces that you see as impacting the future? And I think that would be where we could wrap it up. But what are they?
Yeah. So in the most recent book, Curve Benders, entire chapter 2 is on 15 forces that we've researched that we believe will dramatically, if not profoundly, impact, just like this pandemic did, not just the way you work, but also the way you live, the way you play, and the way you give to others. And we divided them up into what you have the most control over are personal. The next layer out is the organizational. The next layer out is industry. And let me just highlight 3 for you and your audience that we believe, and again, our longitudinal research shows to be dramatically impactful. First one's going to be fairly obvious, which is technology. If you think about where we've been with technology 10 years ago, if I told you could lay in bed and get your news, buy anything you wanted, do a whole lot of things on a piece of glass, you would think I'm crazy. we believe, and our research shows, the technology implications in the next decade, from AI to blockchain to drone technology to quantum computing, it's going to impact every facet of our lives. So that's number one. Number two is geopolitics. For years, our perception was, well, that's just the other side of the world, or that doesn't impact me. And the blockage in Suez Canal, literally on the other side of the world, showed that the ripple effect on supply chain, the ripple effect on cost of supply chain. And now we're still seeing the supply challenges with this global pandemic. The third one I would submit to you is really what I call the haves and have-nots. And Jeff, most economists at the moment talk about the recovery having a shape. So for your audience, if you think of a check mark, that's a very fast decline and a very accelerated recovery. A U-shaped is an immediate decline, maybe a prolonged kind of low, and then again, an accelerated recovery. What I wrote about in Curve Benders is what we're calling the K-shaped recovery. And if you think about haves and have-nots, you said a lot of people are in the knowledge economy. I want you to think of those who are not. That single mother that, can't afford a laptop computer to teach her child at home. That restaurant waiter, or that bellman at that hotel that got laid off, and that's all they know. We believe certain segment of the population, the haves, are going to accelerate their recovery from this pandemic, and they'll become more resilient because of it. Unfortunately, there's a whole slew of the population that are the have-nots, and they're actually headed for a very different direction. And if we don't do something about that population, if we don't send the elevator down to bring them back up, you're going to have civil unrest like we've never seen before. You're going to have a lot of conflict like we've never seen before. And my blessings or my wealth and my house and my car will mean nothing if I don't feel safe leaving my house, if I don't feel safe going into key parts of the town that I live in. So I think we all have a responsibility, particularly as knowledge workers, to also give to the less fortunate, give to the less represented, give to the less capable, to really help them. You can't help somebody who doesn't want to help themselves, but I think it would be a big mistake to ignore a big part of the population that are the have-nots.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you that we need to look after each other. We're on this planet together. We're in lockdown here in Sydney because of the Delta strain outbreak. My cleaner can't come to my home, and she relies on that to put food on the table. And I said to her, because she's not a knowledge worker, I said to her, look, during this lockdown, I'm going to pay you to clean my house, even when you're not cleaning my house. It's just a small thing. It's not a lot of money, but I think we've got to look after each other. And because, like you said, civil unrest, riots could break out because you got the haves and the have-nots, and they're going to get angry.
I did two things similarly that I thought might be useful to you. I bought a subscription from my barber.
Yep.
So I said, let me pay you for the next year's haircuts. I'll come once a month, but I'm going to give you that cash up front now.
Yep.
Similarly, the guy who would give me rides to the airport, I've been using the same guy ever since my kids were little, and now they're in university. Same thing. I said, let me pay you in advance for the rides I may need for the next year. And again, these are the people that, because of this pandemic, their business, their income has been decimated.
Exactly.
And for all of us to kind of take care of them goes a long way.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just to wrap up, what are 1, 2, 3 things that you think our audience needs to know about nurturing and building relationships strategically?
believe it or not, everybody, number one, everybody wants more. I'm coaching people to focus on fewer relationships, but make sure they're authentic, make sure they're real, make sure they're mutually value-based, number one.
Yep.
Number two, no growth ever comes from a place of comfort. So the more you stretch yourself, the more you extend yourself, the more you attend, consume a lean information diet, but put yourself in places where you may not know it all. It helps to extend, expand your reach, your knowledge, your relationships. Last but not least, everybody makes to-do lists. Very few people make stop doing lists. What are some things you're doing with your relationships that are not helping you? What are some things that typically are behaviors you need to change, you need to modify to really elevate the relationships you already have to a very different level? So think about relationships you're neglecting. Think about relationships you're hopefully unintentionally turning off. And what are some of the things you need to stop doing to really elevate your lens, your perspective to a very different level?
I love that one on simplicity is less is more. And I came across a phrase the other day, which is we constantly battle every day. There is a war on simplicity. The world is trying to make life more complex for us. And I think as humans, less is definitely more. And I think that's a great insight.
A friend of mine calls, says, you know, what's brilliant? Something so simple right in front of us that nobody's ever thought of before.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, David. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been some fantastic insights. And I look forward to catching up in real life and breaking bread and building a relationship sometime in the future, sooner rather than later. So how can they find you? How can my listeners find you, David?
It was very kind of you to have me. If you just go to Nour Group, Nour group.com, it's our website. If you go to nourgroup.com/forum, that's our private online community. I'd love to have you and your audience come join us, and let's continue the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.